Hello everyone, welcome back to this series of 100 videos for 100 cantos of the Divine Comedy. Today is Paradiso 5, Canto 5. Before starting with Paradiso 5, I realized that I haven't really talked about the visuals and the iconography related to Paradiso much so far, compared to what I've done with Purgatorio and Inferno. And it's, for obvious reasons, it's difficult to think of visualizing the cantos of Paradiso in the same way that it was a little bit easier to do it for Purgatorio and Inferno. And it's interesting to see how artists across the centuries have been struggling with trying to portray what Dante is talking about in Paradiso, because it's really not always easy. So first of all, I wanted to mention a website that is sponsored by the Società Dante Alighieri, or Dante Alighieri Society, which I just found out about, and it's great. I'm going to put the link in the description here. It's a website that categorizes and catalogs many, I think it's hundreds, if not thousands, of pictures that and artworks and paintings that have been inspired by the Divine Comedy across the centuries. And you can easily kind of surf through the website canto by canto, Cantica, Inferno, Paradiso, Purgatorio, and see the ones that you care about, or depending on where you are in your reading of the Divine Comedy. I think it's an extremely well-made website, and I recommend you to go there and take a look if you like. In terms of the books that I have and the depictions that I'm seeing in my books, one that I showed in the very beginning is this Paradiso book by Franco Nembrini and Gabriele Dell'Otto. Gabriele Dell'Otto is an artist, and he's been working for some of the largest comic book companies and publishers like Marvel, like DC maybe. And so he's got a modern style. And as you can see here, you have Dante thinking that Piccarda's soul is in fact the reflection of somebody behind him, and so he turns around like that. I'll try to show the drawing a little better in this video. But really, for each canto, the problem is what are we going to visualize if Dante keeps talking about theology and abstract concepts? It's not easy. For example, Beatrice, canto after canto, she keeps becoming more and more luminous and bright. So here, Gabriele Dell'Otto tries to express that by showing Dante, who is trying to protect his sight from her brightness, from the luminosity of Beatrice. And once again, this is not maybe a visual style that everybody will love, because it's a little modern, but I enjoy it. And finally, for this Canto 5, the illustration by Gabriele Dell'Otto is this one, which I find really perfect, because we can see this character that is not very clearly visible, appearing all phosphorescent almost, and full of light that is coming from inside himself. Canto number 5 is a canto that is not read very much. I'm thinking in particular about Italian high schools, where Dante is taught as part of the Italian education. Canto 5 was not taught to me in my school, and is not one of the most popular or famous ones of Paradiso. On the other hand, is a canto of great importance, because the thread that Dante has been really following from Canto 1 and 2 and 3 about human freedom, freedom of will, etc., is really almost culminating here in great reflections, deep reflections about not only human will, but in general, the exaltation of the human. And many people say that humanism in general, as a cultural movement, finds a lot of his roots in Dante, in the Divine Comedy. He was almost a pre-humanist in how, within a religious context, he shifted slightly the focus on the human being, on the value of the human being as the greatest creation of God, and the difference between the human creation with anything else in the world. The canto has two very separate times, or maybe portions. The first one still in the sphere of the moon, then we have the ascension towards the second heaven, to the sphere of Mercury, and a moment in the second part in the sphere of Mercury. Let's remember that every heaven is obviously a huge sphere that is all around the Earth like an onion, but Dante and Beatrice use the actual planet, that's how he calls them, Mercury, the moon, etc., to find a place to stay, to find a sense of a location for them to stay there and meet with the images of the saints and the blessed ones. From a really high level, I think it's pretty easy to summarize what is going on here, because Dante is coming from the conversation with Picarda and the questions that that conversation sparked in him. If you remember, the main questions were about the fact that she broke her vow in a forceful way, forced by external causes. And so this made him reflect a lot. And we see how throughout Paradiso, Dante's theological questions are never easy questions. They are, and this is why Paradiso is a little bit difficult, because he wants to hone in on the thorniest and most delicate and most important questions that he has and that he considers the most important questions of Christian theology. So here, the point of everything is still free will, human will, as the greatest gift of God to human beings. And in the first part of the canto, we can see that the entire dialogue between Beatrice and Dante, even if it's mainly Beatrice's monologue, is all around this question by Dante, that Beatrice reads in his mind, which is: Tu vuoi saper se con altro servigio, per manco voto, si può render tanto che l'anima si curi di Letigio. This is verse 13. In other words, you wish to know if, through a righteous act, one can repair a promise unfulfilled, so that the soul and God are reconciled. Spontaneously, in the previous canto, Dante was wondering if there was some kind of way out for somebody who had broken a vow, by compensating with some other good action or good work. He, in this canto, sounds particularly rigorous and strict because he is reacting from this environment of generalized laxity that was very common in his days. Beatrice then helps Dante understand that there's not much to do once you have made a vow to God, especially for important topics, like, for example, obedience, the vow of obedience, vow of chastity. This, because of the way the vow works, and because you are sacrificing your own free will to God, there is no way to take it back. And so, as a general rule, and he makes it very clear, there are maybe some caveats here and there that he takes from Leviticus, but the general answer from Beatrice to Dante's question is a no. There might be some ways to get out, especially about the content of the vow, if we're talking about a matter that is particularly small, but Beatrice's answer is negative. At that point, they start flying again very fast, very quickly, up to the second heaven, the heaven of Mercury. They arrive to Mercury, and they will meet a group of splendid, luminous souls, and one of them in particular will address Dante and will find out who this soul is and how Dante approaches the soul. And then in Canto VI, we will find out that he's a very famous Roman emperor, and there will be a political conversation, a political dialogue in Canto VI. But let's start from the very beginning. We remember that at the end of Canto IV, Dante was almost fainting because of this luminescence from Beatrice, and he couldn't see her because her light, the light that was coming from her face, was increasing to a point that he couldn't stand it almost anymore. And that's where the direct dialogue from Beatrice starts from here. S'io ti fiammeggio, nel caldo d'amore, di là dal modo che in terra si vede, sì che del viso tuo vinco il valore, non ti maravigliar, che ciò procede da perfetto veder, che, come apprende, Così nel bene appreso muove il piede. The tone is of joy, again, after a very joyous Canto 4 and Canto 3. All of Paradiso is full of joy. And there are some interesting scholarly diatribes here. I'm going to highlight maybe only one. There is one particular term, which is perfetto veder. Perfetto veder means perfect seeing or perfect vision. And Dante scholars don't seem to agree on whose vision this is. Is it Dante's or is it Beatrice's? Because in the Mandelbaum translation, it sounds like this. I am so because of my perfect vision, as I grasp the good, so I approach the good in act. Beatrice is justifying her brightness and why she is looking like this. Mandelbaum clearly is incorporating in his translation the interpretation that this veder, perfetto veder, is of Beatrice. But I've noticed that other translations do the opposite and interpret it in the way that perfetto veder is Dante's veder. So they would never translate it as my perfected vision. So potentially, if your translation says my perfected vision and I grasped it, etc., it might be wrong. I don't know what's right and what's wrong, but there is this problem in the interpretation. I have an opinion. My personal opinion is that Dante might have left this voluntarily open because he is using the indeterminate infinite of the verb to see, which is veder. And so this perfetto veder, or this sign, which is causing increased brightness and all this luminescence, could, with just one word and one sentence, mean from both sides. It could be Beatrice, on one hand, whose sight is perfect because she is already blessed, and so with this perfect, due to her perfect sight, the fact that she sees things perfectly into the heavens and into God, she is so bright in herself, and this is where all this increased light is coming from. On the other hand, if it was Dante's sight, if the veder was referred to Dante, it would mean that it's his own seeing is improving. He is now, he does now a perfect sight from his eyes because he's been purified and he's gone through all this process. And through this perfect sight, he can see the truth better and better. And the truth is pure light. Personally, I like this second interpretation a little better, especially because the sentence follows as come apprende. And this apprende depends how you interpret the verb, because the verb could mean two things. It could mean something like somebody is advancing in his knowledge of God, in the sense of educating and learning. And obviously, if this was the interpretation, it would be Dante's vision, because Beatrice doesn't have to learn. She's already at full knowledge. Or apprende could mean something like perceives or apprehends. And in this case, it could be also referred to Beatrice. So, my opinion is that it's possible that Dante has left it open to both because it works, because all this increased light, increased grace and knowledge is that of Beatrice, who has full and perfect knowledge, and Dante, who is learning more and more the fine points of theology and Christianity and increasing in his own internal understanding. Something that could go completely unnoticed is on verse 11, Dante uses a term which is vestigio, and he says, non è se non di quella alcun vestigio. It is a vestige of the light which gleams through that lesser thing. This is almost verbatim taken from Augustine. St. Augustine said all of the universe is nothing else than the vestigium, or in Latin, which is basically the imprint of the divine goodness. And Dante takes that concept and puts it here. And then this pretty central moment at verse 13, where Beatrice expresses Dante's question. You wish to know if, through a righteous act, one can repair a promise unfulfilled. So this servigio in Italian is a righteous act, a good act. And letigio, that rhymes with servigio, is in fact coming from a juridical term, something that comes from the canonic law, And for somebody like me who's been studying law in the past, in the very, very ancient past, Roman law was very, not only intertwined with canonic law and the law of the Catholic Church, but also informed a huge part of our Western law, especially civil law. And this particular word, litigio, comes from Roman law, and it meant something like a challenge, like a controversy. That's what litigio stands for. Lo maggior don che Dio per la sua larghezza fesse creando e alla sua bontate più conformato e quel che più apprezza. Fu della volontà la libertate. Fu della volontà la libertate. Central verse. Di che le creature intelligenti, e tutte e sole, fuori e son dotate. All intelligent creatures, and only intelligent creatures, are the only ones, human beings and angels, they are the only ones who are gifted by God with free will, intellect and free will. It's important because animals are only gifted with instincts. That's what they follow, only and purely instincts. And this is really part of the important central point that Dante is making in trying to constantly elevate the human being, nobilitate the human being. The entire Divine Comedy is something that wants us to be saved, of course, in a sense of to feel healthy and happy, but also is trying to make us feel good about ourselves, about what we are, to nobilitate our nature compared to everything else that we see around the world that are God-created creatures, living creatures, etc., but who have not been gifted free will like we have been. In these same years that Dante was writing Paradiso, he had already started writing his De Monarchia as well, his long, let's say, work about politics and religion, and but specifically politics. And in the Monarchia, Dante wrote, the freedom of will is the greatest gift that God ever gave to man, because through this kind of specific gift, we can reach happiness right here as human beings, right here on earth as human beings. And we can reach happiness beyond in the afterlife as divine beings. He even calls the free will at verse 29, he calls it tesoro or treasure. In fact, Mandelbaum says, for when a pact is drawn between a man and God, then through free will, a man gives up what I have called his treasure, his free will. It's a little complex as a structure, this sentence, because Dante then adds something that's very crucial, which is at verse 30, he says, e fassi col suo atto, which is a very, very short little piece of a verse, but it's so crucial because the pact itself, with which you make a vow with God, is made using your free will. So free will is your greatest treasure, and it's what you sacrifice, you basically give back to God who has given it to you. And in order to make this holy pact with God, you use your free will itself. This is very interesting because there is a difference, even if it's very slight, between how Dante saw this system of vows and St. Thomas Aquinas wrote about them. They came more or less to the same conclusion. However, St. Thomas Aquinas always had a slightly more juridical accent and tone in his theology. So he would refer to juridical terms, even when it comes to making vows to God. Dante always takes it back to the personal, to the spiritual, to your own soul, your own relationship with God, basically. And in this way, maybe he makes Christian theology a little bit more universal. In any case, fassi col suo atto, dunque, che render possi per ristoro. So if this is the highest gift that God has given us, what else can you give instead of it? If you decide that if you have given it up and sacrificed it for God, you want to change it with something else. The answer is, the question is rhetorical, because the answer is nothing. On this point, I have a paragraph from Robert Hollander that I really like, because he is very clear in, let's say, articulating the point that Beatrice is making here. And he says, Given the special status of the freedom of our will and given the nature of a vow to God, made freely, the free will itself becomes part of what is pledged. That is, one sacrifices the right to will any differently in the future. In other words, it's a pledge to will no farther, at least within that matter that is with respect to the matter of the particular vow. The result is that one is not free to make a substitution for what is originally promised, since that would be to replace the original sacrifice with something of less value, or simply to attempt to use again what had already been surrendered. And this is exactly what Dante says with a metaphor, with a simile, here in the next verses. He says, se credi bene usare quel che hai offerto, di mal tolletto vuoi far buon lavoro. To use again what you had offered would mean seeking to do good with ill-got gains, as if you have robbed somebody, you've stolen something, and with this loot that you have from your crime, you want to do some kind of good works. Now, as I mentioned before, there was this habit in Dante's times of laxity, of making some vows without really a lot of responsibility or seriousness, because a big part of the church, not everybody, let's be clear, not all the clergy were corrupt, etc., but it was a habit. It was a habit that if somebody didn't have courage enough or just didn't feel like fulfilling the vow, they would go to the specific priest or member of the clergy. A particular sum of money was going to be agreed, it was paid, and you were free of your vow. This was, in fact, a system that was pretty complex and structured, even if, of course, it was not part of anything that was codified in the New Testament, in the Bible, if not maybe in the Old Testament, in the Leviticus, but we'll chat about that later. So Dante here is gradually taking more and more prophetic stance, but in this case, and that's the difference from something that he's done back in Inferno, where he was speaking as a prophet. In this case, he is much more solemn and much more confident about himself as a prophet, as somebody who is scolding us, scolding people in general, who are not seeing the importance and the seriousness of a pact with God. But this scolding is done with love, is scolding that is done for the purpose of salvation and happiness of the people who are having these behaviors. Dante is always thinking in Christian terms, and therefore love is at the center of his concerns. Another great diamond of Italian literature is the Betrothed, written by Alessandro Manzoni in about 200 years ago. And The Betrothed is a historic novel that is absolutely wonderful. It has a Christian center and focus, and it also has one of the main characters. Her name is Lucia, a woman of northern Italy, who at a certain point finds herself in such a desperate situation that she is she's crying, etc., and she's brought by her conditions to make a vow to Mary, and to vow to her that she will basically sacrifice her own virginity. She makes a vow of chastity to Mary, as long as Mary can help her out of this desperate situation. And this is very interesting from a theological point of view as well, because in analyzing that particular scene in the Betrothed, we can see very similar reasoning of what Dante follows here. Because St. Thomas Aquinas, always our, let's say, main theologian and lawmaker even for Dante, said that there are three conditions to make a vow with God. And these three conditions in the Summa Theologia are the deliberatio, the actual decision inside yourself, the propositum voluntatis, so this decision inside yourself needs to be in a moment where you have full cognition, you have full control of your mental abilities and capacities. And number three, the promissio, which is the promise in itself that needs to be a legitimate promise. So, in the case of Lucia, in the betrothed, two of these conditions, in fact, were not met. And this is why later on in the betrothed, another character, a priest, a very smart priest, tells her that the vow that she made to Mary is not valid for this reason. The first one is the propositum voluntatis. She was in such a distressed situation. She couldn't really think straight. And in that moment, she did not have full control over faculties. Therefore, that is almost and very close to what would be an attenuation of guilt for a crime committed under, I don't know, some type of influence that takes away a little bit of your agency, your voluntary agency. And the second point is the promissio. She, in fact, technically could not promise her virginity to Mary because she had already promised herself to her fiance, Renzo. That's the other main character of the novel. And therefore, she was making a promise that was breaking another vow that had been made under God. So it wasn't valid for these reasons. And in the Italian literary landscape, all the stories and the narrations in the Betrothed, which I warmly recommend you to read at some point if you haven't yet, because it's absolutely wonderful, have a lot to do with this topic of the vows. And in fact, there is a lot of echoes of the Divine Comedy in the Betrothed as well. In fact, St. Thomas shines out of these verses at verse 43, where Dante says, due cose si convengono, due cose si convegnono, in fact, due cose si convegnono all'essenza di questo sacrificio. L'una è quella di che si fa, l'altra è la convenienza. So the vow is made of two things. One is the matter of the pledge, and the second one is the convenienza, the compact or the agreement in itself. And this is the one that can never be cancelled. Quest'ultima, this last, never be annulled until the compact is fulfilled. So this is the general answer of Beatrice. The answer is no. You cannot rescind this agreement with God to give away your free will. And here there is a first reference to Leviticus in the Old Testament, because Dante says, Beatrice says, therefore the Hebrews found it necessary to bring their offerings, although some of their offerings might be altered. As you must know, because you must know Leviticus, you must have studied the Leviticus. Even if they were not bringing a particular offering, it was possible to substitute with something else, but the offering in itself still had to be done. And here it becomes even more interesting because there is a mathematic of the substitution that for Leviticus is specifically set at a rate of exchange of 120%, which means that whatever you substitute your old vow with the new vow, this new vow has to be something that is at least 20% more valuable than the old one. Beatrice, in a strange way that we can only understand under a certain cultural perspective, she's like raising the ante from 120% to 150%, because in this famous verse she says the 4 in 6, so il 4 nel 6. I'm talking about verse number 59, where she says, unless the thing one sets aside is not contained in one's new weight as 4 in 6, therefore 150%. So there are fundamentally two conditions for a substitution of the matter of your vow. The first condition is that the church approves it. You cannot do it by your own judgment, by yourself. This is why it's beautiful here. The image that Dante uses is la chiave bianca e della gialla, the silver key and the golden key, that, by the way, those two keys are still on the flag of the Vatican. They are the symbol of the papacy. And the second condition is that the size of the new matter that constitutes the vow is at least just like 6 compared to 4, so 150%. And very important, in any case, when the matter of a vow has so much weight and worth that it tips every scale, that is so important, and scholars say that in general Dante here is referring to a vow of chastity, vow of obedience. No other way can serve as substitute. So this, rather than being a loophole in the law, is more a way for Beatrice to say to Dante that it's almost impossible to find situations where you can actually substitute and mutate the matter of your vow. It's being very strict and saying in 99% of cases you cannot substitute what you have pledged to God. Only if the matter is so tiny and small and trivial, maybe you can substitute it, as long as the new one is much, much bigger. Now, why this 150% compared to 120? I've seen a part of Teodolinda Barolini, always extremely valid commentary about this canto, and she makes a very interesting point where she talks about cultural competitiveness, a cultural competition between Christians and the Jewish in Dante's times, and Dante buys into this competition and he plays completely into this competition because he wants Christianity to come up in a better light or almost victorious compared to the Jewish, who were historically and famously very precise in any part of the legalism of their faith and their religion. So wherever Leviticus talks about 120, Dante says, we are better, we are going to surpass this 120 with the 150. And this explains the comment that Beatrice makes at verse 80, «Sì che il giudeo di voi, tra voi non rida», which of course is tinted with anti-Semitism. And we've seen a little bit of anti-Semitism in the Divine Comedy here and there anyway, which was absorbed by Dante culturally, very normally, because it was his times. But the point of having this sentence here, which is in English, so that the Jew who lives among you not deride you. The Jew being the only non-Christian in your community of Christians here in Florence, for example, who knows the law, he knows the scriptures law, don't make him laugh. Don't, because you are in a certain competition with him. And so let's make sure that we come out as more noble than the Jewish people. That's kind of the message that Dante is sending here. Then, before taking his almost officially prophetic tone, Dante gives us two comparisons. One comes from the classic world and one from the biblical world. The biblical world talks about Jephthah. Jephthah was, in the Bible, someone who promised to God that he would have sacrificed to God the first living being that would have come to greet him as soon as he returned home, after victory that had been granted by God as an exchange. And of course, the first living being that comes out and greets him is his daughter. And at that point, instead of saying mal feci, which is what Dante says he should have done, which is I did amiss, and not fulfill the vow, he actually fulfilled the vow, therefore becoming impious. Before, he was just stupid by making that vow. Once he actually killed the daughter to fulfill the vow, he became impious in front of us. So that's an example of a wrong way to manage the vow. A second example is the one very famous of King Agamemnon of the Greeks, who, when with his fleet he was going to attack Troy, I think the fleet was stopped somewhere and they were waiting for the wind to be favorable to the fleet to go towards Troy, and he vowed for the gods to change the winds in his favor, and fundamentally sacrificed his daughter in this disastrous pledge. We've heard about Agamemnon's daughter Iphigenia from many, well, in fact there is a Euripides tragedies, but Dante in particular, he had heard about Agamemnon and Iphigenia from probably Cicero and Virgil, probably from the Latin poets. In any case, these are some perfect comparisons. And finally, Dante starts with, you can feel the change of tone, because at verse 73, this is the Dante the prophet, Dante the Christian zealot, in a sense, who says, Christians, proceed with greater gravity. Do not be like a feather at each wind, nor think that all immersions wash you clean. Try to be serious, try to be more responsible. You have both testaments, the Old and the New. And this is, again, a little bit of an indirect reference to the Jewish people, who only have the Old Testament. You have both testaments, the Old and the New. You have the shepherd of the church, who's the Pope, and who, let's remember, Dante still respects very much, despite here he's not talking about that specific individual Pope, of course, because he put him in hell. He's talking about the institution, the person who is being instituted by Christ in the gospel when he gave the responsibility to Peter, to St. Peter, to guide you. You need no more than this for your salvation, and don't listen to anybody if evil greed will summon you elsewhere. So if somebody tells you differently, do not believe them, because vows are not necessary for your salvation. This is what Dante is saying. You can be saved if you follow what Mother Church tells you, and if you follow what the Old and the New Testament tell you. The vows are not necessary. A very famous verse here, uomini siate e non pecore matte, se mala cupidigia altro vi rida. Be men. In other words, follow your shepherd, follow the church, but follow as men, as human beings, someone who is noble and elevated, and not like crazy sheep who do whatever they tell them to do without even thinking, without even using their rationality. I also like this image of the lamb very much. Do not act like the foolish wanton lamb that leaves its mother's milk and heedless wants to war against its very self. Non fate come agnel che lascia il latte. Don't be Christians who stray away from the teachings of Mother Church. So after verse 88, we have the beginning of the second part of this beautiful canto, and the second part sees Beatrice and Dante fly up to the heaven of Mercury, and there is so much light and reflections of light. It's really beautiful, but it's also fairly straightforward compared to the first part of the canto. It's more readable. We can see what Dante means much more easily. From a poetic point of view and from the visual beauty of Dante's poetry, my personal favorite, as you can imagine probably, is after verse 100, this image of the fishes that come out of a fish pool, as in a fish pool that is calm and clear. The fish draw close to anything that nears from outside if it seems to be their fare. It's also curious to note how these souls, the exclamation that they make as soon as they see Dante, they say, "Here now is one who will increase our loves." Most scholars, the majority of scholars, agree that probably the meaning of this exclamation is they say this, their love will increase because they have the chance, the opportunity to answer Dante's questions and therefore make him happy. This exchange of love in this sense. Or maybe it could be simply that they are very happy to see Dante's mission that is wanted by God, and so they can help it. But then later on, we see this. There is one of these souls in particular who addresses Dante, and this soul is somebody who lived in antiquity. He was a very famous Roman emperor who had an immense impact on all of our Western civilization, really immense, especially on that part of the Western civilization who studied law, like me. So that's in fact Emperor Justinian, and we'll see him in the next canto. The language is interesting because after verse 115, Dante puts a very emperor-like language in Justinian's mouth. He talks about the thrones, the eternal triumph, your war of life. It doesn't actually say war of life in Italian. Dante says milizia, simple milizia, which means combat and war, as a pure metaphor for our life. So it It's a person who's speaking who has very imperial concerns in his mind. Beatrice encourages Dante to talk to this soul, to Justinian, with a very musical sentence. Beatrice, di sicuramente, e credi come a Dii, as if they were gods. That's how truthful they're going to be with you. So believe what they have to say, trust what they have to say. Here, Dante is more thinking of St. Augustine. St. Augustine said, God became man so that man could become God. Or in other words, he meant that Christianity and the sacrifice of Jesus allowed human beings to elevate themselves and to nobilitate themselves so much as to achieve, after their death, of course, in the afterlife, a level of sanctity and divinity. This is something that is visually represented very, very well by this constant shining. Everybody is shining like crazy in Paradiso, more and more, to the point that as we pass this particular heaven, it will be even more difficult, if not impossible, for Dante to actually recognize the facial features of the blessed and the saints. This is Canto V. I'm very glad we got here. Canto VI, like in every one of the three canticas, is the political canto. Thank you very much again for listening to this few comments, and I cannot wait for Canto VI of Paradiso next time. Thanks again.